Welcome to Inside Badger Nation on Madison CW. Now your hosts, Ben Wargle and Phil Dawson.
Welcome into Inside Badger Nation, another edition where we fill you in with the latest from the Wisconsin Badgers. My name is Phil Dawson for the Big 1070 Radio here in Madison, joined by Ben Wargle, BadgerNation.com, editor and publisher there. Huge show for you again today because we will be recapping football signing day. National Signing Day was huge last week. Had Gary Anderson right on this program. Of course, you can find last week's episode at YouTube where we go one-on-one with Coach Anderson. We'll start, though, with some Badger Hoops, plus have an email question of the week, which is pretty timely and relevant in regards to Gary Anderson and the NFL. We'll get there in a little bit. Let's start, though, Ben, with Badger Hoops, coming off of a big victory against Michigan State, and it came down to the wire again. And when it comes down to the wire for the Wisconsin Badgers, what do? They give it to T-Jack. Trey Jackson with the game winner right before the buzzer. 2.1 seconds left on the clock there. But as we did see, the Badgers tooth and nail, hard-fought battle throughout and end up getting the win.
This was kind of like a redemption day for Wisconsin on a number of different levels. I mean, first up, you beat Michigan State for the first time, I believe, in 3 years. I mean, Michigan State had owned this series as of late, winning 5 straight. You look at what this victory meant for Wisconsin. You break a 3-game home losing streak, the first 3-game home losing streak under Bo Ryan. And more importantly for Jackson, who's kind of been the lightning rod of this team, a lot of criticism he's drawn his way. Just a really solid effort by him in the closing seconds. Didn't have the greatest game, 3 for 5 from the field, 7 points. He had 5 turnovers, but you look deeper into numbers for him. 8 assists, team high, game high actually, 5 rebounds, and that important jumper that we're going to see here in a little bit. There's his 3-pointer that he made. Just very timely contributions for this team in this game. You look at Wisconsin, they had gone through some of those shooting lulls that really hurt them at points. Really didn't have that against Michigan State. They shot 50% from the field in the second half, 55.6% from three-point line. Here's the winner from Jackson, just a clutch shot. And the funny thing was, this kind of was what happened a week ago against Ohio State. Obviously, Wisconsin here, a little struggle with defense, but they able to get this win. And for Jackson, he took a lot of criticism for how he handled the last possession against Ohio State when they were down 1 with about 8.7 left. Here you have about the same amount of time, and Jackson gets a good screen from Frank Kaminsky, good spacing on the court. He decides to take the pull-up jumper instead of driving because Adrian Payne, who had a monster game, was lurking, and just a clutch shot from Jackson. He's done it for 2 years, and Wisconsin fans, like him or not, he's the most clutch shooter on this team, and the players on the team expect him to take those big shots, and more often than not, he makes them for the team.
Yeah, and so many things in this game to point out. And right on the near side of your screen, now this is one of 3 of Gary Harris's field goals. He was 3 of 20 in the game. Josh Gosser running with him the entire game. Plus, Gosser had a strong performance offensively, too. And really, looking at Gosser and what he did with Gary Harris, that's the leading scorer in the Big Ten and able to take out one of the main offensive options because, as we know, Michigan State missing both Keith Appling and Brandon Dawson out of this game, but they did everything they needed to do to get the win defensively, offensively, and then, like you said, the lightning rod, the conundrum that is Trey Jackson. So let me start there, Ben, with you. The conundrum that is Jackson, because, again, had 2 turnovers in that final 2 minutes, is a guy that is catching some of the heat, the wrath of Badger fans, but this team cannot be as elite as it possibly can be without him kind of being at his best.
He goes with, the team goes with how he goes. There's no question about that. You look offensively, the last 2 games for Trayvon Jackson against Illinois, a big road win for Wisconsin to kind of break that long skid that they had. Kind of a funky environment last Tuesday in Champaign. A snowstorm had blanketed the area. The arena was only half full. There wasn't that same amount of atmosphere that you usually get when you go down to, what's it called now, the State Farm Center down there in Champaign. But Jackson had a very solid game. It was across the board, very, very good for Wisconsin. Wisconsin had one of their best offensive outputs in a number of weeks. Now you look at this game too. The assists were important, the rebounds were important, but again, those turnovers kept Michigan State in the game. Wisconsin also has some missed free throws in this game. Ben Bruss, who's like a 94% free throw shooter, missed the front end of a 1-on-1 that kept Michigan State in the game. Still some issues with some post defense, I think you can agree with, but still, Josh Gosser, you mentioned the 3 for 20 for Gary Harris, 0 for 7 from 3-point range also for Harris. Josh Gosser, phenomenal job that kept Wisconsin in this basketball game.
We're also seeing Nigel Hayes turn into a pretty important factor. Now, in this game against Michigan State, he goes 8 of 12 from the free throw line, played some good body-to-body up defense on an Adrian Payne. But he's turning into a fan favorite, too, as soon as he checked in, there's applause. And then as soon as he touches the ball, we see that he's a guy that people love to watch play, because I think he has a different kind of game that's been at Wisconsin for a while, a back to the basket kind of post player, and then getting to the free throw line.
He joked after the game that he said people must be mistaking him for Sam Decker with that kind of applause. But you look at what Nigel Hayes has done. He's carrying this team over the last 2 months. And I say that because he has shown the most toughness of all the players on this team. Maybe Josh Gosser and him are neck and neck for who's the toughest player on this team, but he's by far the most aggressive when it comes to the low post. Frank Kaminsky, for whatever reason, has kind of gone into hibernation here the last couple of weeks. Against Illinois, only attempted 1 shot. I mean, he was at a long drought from the perimeter until he hit a big three-pointer against Michigan State, which actually helped the Badgers. But still, you need that post dominance on your team. You need a guy who can drive into the paint, draw fouls, get to the free throw line. Nigel Hayes is doing that, and he's one of the most important players on this team for Wisconsin.
Got a big one with Michigan this weekend, but when we come back, we're going to talk National Signing Day right here on IBN. Welcome back to Inside Badger Nation. Phil and Ben with you as we're taking a look at National Signing Day. Just a week ago, we had Gary Anderson on this very program talking about really the overall look at the class and highlighting some of the maybe key players that he was talking about. But we're going to highlight some of the other ones, too, that could make some impacts maybe in the short term as well, maybe see him this year. Let's start, though, first with some of the news, too, from last week, that Thomas Hammock taking a new job with the Baltimore Ravens, so a new running backs coach is going to have to come in for the Wisconsin Badgers. But he comes into a spot that's pretty well known. It's a coveted position because you have some good backs, and that's included in this 2014 class, adding, I think, 3 of them, depending on how you want to put Ula Tolotau at. But you do start with this guy right here. Caleb Kinlaw, 5'9", 190-pound running back out of South Carolina. And this is a guy, Ben, that may be taking that role of a James White. You get a big pounder. You already have Melvin Gordon and Corey Clement, but you get a big pounding kind of running back in a Taiwan deal who's a bigger, maybe stronger kind of back that he is. And then you get this guy, the change of pace, great footwork kind of running back in Caleb Kinlaw that just fits the mold. I
think Kinlaw could step in right away next year in that James White type of role because he can do so many things really well. I mean, you look at his prep career, almost 4,200 yards, 3,000 yard season. So he's used to that type of workman-like mentality that you need at a school like Wisconsin where running the football is so important. And also, too, you look at 52 touchdowns in 39 career games. So he obviously has that nose for the end zone that Wisconsin loves to have. And, you look at Kinlaw, I mean, this was a guy who was committed to Georgia Tech. Thomas Hammock watched him a lot, went down and watched him during the bye week in October, made the scholarship offer, and then eventually was able to flip him. You look at all the commits that Wisconsin flipped in this class, I say Kinlaw was the most important because he's the guy who can bring that instant impact to the field next year. Really a talented player who could step in and do a number of things. I mean, between the tackles, outside the tackles,
right
catch
here,
the ball in the
footwork.
backfield, and that vision and athleticism is just natural abilities that you just can't teach.
Yeah, and we also saw just this past season that third running back, whoever it may be, can get some touches and can be productive. Almost had a third 1,000-yard rusher in Corey Clement. Meanwhile, have another running back to look at. Well, first we'll start with an offensive lineman that they can maybe run behind, and part of the Poly Pipeline. Had a chance to catch up with Coach Chad, the defensive line coach, who also, being a Hawaiian, recruits Hawaii. And what did he find? Big Micah Kapoy, 6'4", 305 pounds, starting that Poly Pipeline here at Wisconsin.
He's probably the most underrated player in this class. I mean, he's the only 2-star Scout.com prospect in Wisconsin signing class, and so naturally that kind of makes him a target to be the most underrated. But you just watch him play, and he's like a 6'4", 305, like we said, but he plays like he's 280. He's got such great footwork, and that comes from him being a 3-year letter winner in basketball. Wisconsin really targets those two-sport athletes because they're used to competing. They're used to, really being in the athletic, competitive environment, almost year-round. And Kapoy, first-team All-State selection, first-team All-Oahu selection, and he's a guy who really can do a number of good things for Wisconsin. Probably going to play the interior. Maybe he can move into that center role, but a guy who really is a very talented athlete and a guy who I think, high 3-star, and probably because he played in Hawaii, didn't get a lot of that attention from a lot of schools, outside the Pacific Northwest. And just a guy who really fits the mold of what Wisconsin likes to do. Because of the athleticism, like I mentioned, you can see he's a guy who can do a lot of good things for Wisconsin, be a really good interior player.
Yeah, and I think, too, just looking at the body shape and size, he has the kind of weight that Wisconsin can put on him in that weight room. So you're big, fast, and of course, strong with all that size. Continuing the Poly pipeline, I may end up calling this guy Ooh La La.
He's a guy who He's a guy who certainly could bring that type of reaction, Phil,
right.
Just because you look at his numbers. I mean, he was Utah's Mr. Football selection as a senior. 2,400 yards on just 195 carries. Quick, Phil, 12.5 yards per carry. Do your math and your abacus. 31 touchdowns this past season. 16 of those went for 40 yards or more. So he just has that vision, and he has that strength too. I mean, he's 6'2", 235, so he can break those kind of tackles that you see there. And he has that same type of speed and athleticism, so when he does break it, he can get back to his top-end speed very quickly. And he's going to be a guy who's probably going to be enrolling in 2016. He's an LDS, so he's going to go on a 2-year mission trip. Doesn't know where he's going, and kind of that 2 years will depend on where he's going to play. He could be a tailback, he could be a fullback, he could be a linebacker. All depends on kind of what kind of athleticism, what kind of workouts he can do during that 2-year period. But a guy who you watch him, you need to have the football in his hands. I mean, he's just such a dynamic athlete with what he can do, and he's got a little flair to him too. So he's going to fit in really well with Wisconsin. Wherever they can get him on campus, they're certainly going to take him. Really good find for the Badgers.
Right, and also another offensive lineman that we want to take a look at is Bo Benchwa, 6'5", 280, offensive lineman from Grafton. And what's really interesting about this to me, Ben, is again the size. This is a kid who played, tight end in Grafton. And so he has the size, can build on it, but also route running, speed, again, the footwork, understanding conceptually of what passing routes, or maybe even in terms of running the football with a quarterback. I mean, this might be a prototype new look for a Wisconsin offensive lineman.
Yeah, Wisconsin saw him in the high school summer camp, and they used him as a tight end, an offensive line, and on the defensive line too. And he did so many positions really well that Wisconsin didn't quite know how to recruit him, and so they were kind of late to the party a little bit. But this is a guy at the offensive tackle. You put some weight on him, he could develop into a really good player. His dad played at Wisconsin too, so he knows he has that drive to be a good player.
We hit defense next here on IBN. Welcome back to Inside Badger Nation. Phil Dawson and Ben Wargle with you, talking the 2014 Wisconsin recruiting class a week after National Signing Day. And Ben, we touched on the offense just a little bit ago. Why don't we touch on the defense? Because as a class, right, this is a group that focused on the secondary. And I think it's 5 total secondary players, and not exactly sure if they're going to be corners, safeties, or what exactly their role will be by the time they get on campus and through camps and through falls. But when you look at what this defense starts with and what this class started with, it was looking for some top-end speed in that back end, and I think they found it. It probably starts with this guy right here, safety Serge Trezzi, 6'1", 200-pound safety out of Orlando, Florida. And again, there's a lot of speed, which what we're going to see right here in his film.
Yeah, he actually played junior college football for a couple years at Eastern Arizona. Here's a guy who returned kicks last year, more than 1,300 all-purpose yards, and you can tell just by watching him that he has that top-end speed that Wisconsin really wants to use in the secondary. He also played a little running back last year too, so he's comfortable with the football in his hands, and I think that's going to be key for Wisconsin. Wants to inject some life into their special teams. Also too, talking to some of the defensive back coaches at Wisconsin, they want to use a defense that could put 4 or 5 corners on the field at one time, and you want those guys who aren't pigeonholed into just the safety or the cornerback position. Guys like Trezzi and Tyndall and Dakota Dixon, who we're going to both talk about shortly. But Wisconsin just didn't have that type of personnel last year. You look at Desmond Southward in the last 2 games of the year. He's not a true corner, but they're playing him at a corner spot just because they were short on numbers. And you obviously look at what happened in those 2 games. The 2 teams that Wisconsin played against put up a lot of passing yards against them with a lot of big plays. So you add some speed, you add some athleticism, you add some versatility to your secondary, and that in turn should improve the overall product. And Trezzi's a guy, because he's played 2 years of junior college, has that college level experience, and he'll be able to step in and compete right away and probably help Wisconsin right away in a number of areas on the football field.
Well, you talk about the secondary and where it did start. How about the fact that you had 2 quarterbacks going back there, both Tanner McAvoy and Nate Hammond? So they needed some help, and they found it in Trezzi. Also found it in Derek Tyndall, the cornerback from Florida as well, 5'11", 180 pounds. What can you tell us about him, Ben?
Another guy who was committed to another school and flipped to Wisconsin, originally committed to Indiana at the beginning of January, and Wisconsin was able to make him flip just a couple weeks later. And he's probably the most true cornerback prospect in this class, but he also could play, a nickel corner. He could maybe play a little bit of safety if they need him to. And first team All Broward County, which is incredibly impressive achievement considering the level of talent down there in Florida. An all-state selection on the second team, 33 tackles, 7 pass breakups, and 5 interceptions last year. Finished his career 150 tackles, 10 interceptions, and 13 pass breakups. Numbers are even more impressive when you consider that he really battled through this last senior season, played with a lot of different injuries, some nicks and some bumps and some bruises that maybe let some bigger name schools kind of shy away from him. But certainly a guy who brings the same type of things that we talked about with Trezzy. Speed, athleticism, versatility. A guy who's going to push Shoulder and Shelton, who's going to push Darius Hillary, and talking to Ben Strickland on signing day. That's what Wisconsin wants. They want guys who aren't comfortable with their starting roles. Gary Anderson said, too, on our show last week that he wants guys who can come in, younger players, to push guys like Shelton and like Hillary. And what we've seen is that if you can come in and you can compete early, you're going to be able to play like Soldier and Shelton did. And he had a tremendous season starting for Wisconsin after coming in, early enrollee and proving over the course of spring and summer and fall that he was the most viable candidate to start for Wisconsin. And Tyndall certainly has that ability to do so, and he's going to really add some good characteristics that Wisconsin's looking for going down the road from their secondary.
Well, I think, too, what we saw from Dave Aranda's defense is not just, hey, this guy plays this position the entire game, that if there's an opportunity, if you're good enough to play, we'll get you on the field. Just had so many different packages, and I think we may see even more this year. How about our last one? Now, there weren't any big surprises on National Signing Day for the Wisconsin Badgers, but this certainly was a big get for them. Tell us about Dakota Dixon.
Yeah, kind of the cherry on top for this recruiting class. Dakota Dixon made his announcement on signing day morning, and a guy who picked Wisconsin over Michigan State and West Virginia. Fascinating story with this kid. This is a kid who lost his dad going into high school, really relied on the teachings of his older brother who played at Florida and now is an assistant coach at Ball State, and his middle brother too who played at Mount Union, I believe, and a guy who really had to mature quickly, and a guy who really improved on the field despite all the things going on around him. Here's a guy who's a 4-year star at defensive back and a 3-year team captain. Obviously, you hear a 3-year team captain, you have a lot of respect from your teammates. A guy who's a first-team All-State selection by the Associated Press as a senior. Here's a guy, too, incredibly strong, incredibly smart, 3.9 GPA, and a guy who really can add the same dimensions we've been talking about. And Dakota Dixon is a guy who certainly is going to fill a need for Wisconsin. Safety, he can play cornerback, and someone who can step in right away and compete. Now, he's probably going to take a redshirt year this year. He played last season with a torn labrum in his shoulder, kind of the last year and a half. His coach told me it was common occurrence that the shoulder would pop out once or twice a game, and he would just run over the sideline. They would fix it up for him, tape it up for him, and get him back out on the field. But this is a guy down the road, probably could have the biggest impact of all the defensive players Wisconsin signed, especially in the secondary. He's that talented, he's that multidimensional, and he's that versatile with a lot of speed to him as well.
And again, when you go back and watch this program on YouTube, you may not get the video, but just look at Dakota Dixon. Look him up and see what else he does. He hits people, and Ben Strickland absolutely loves that. All right, when we come back, we have our email question of the week talking about Gary Anderson to the NFL. What? Welcome back to Inside Badger Nation, where we invite you to check us out on YouTube. Just type in Inside Badger Nation to that little search bar if you ever go there, or even on your phone, right? You got a video player? Tweet at us at InBadgerNation, and to see some of the analysis and insight, well, that's where you find it, at InBadgerNation on Twitter. And we invite you to email the show as well, InsideBadgerNation@gmail.com. Our email question of the week is brought to us by 608 Restaurant and Bar. It's 212 State Street, where 608 is more than just an area code. And this question, courtesy of Amanda in DeForest, who heard the story we all did this week. Hey guys, what's up with Anderson talking with the Cleveland Browns? Of course, talking about head coach Gary Anderson, saw a tweet earlier this week from Ian Rappaport of the NFL Network, who said they had secret interview, the Browns did, with Gary Anderson. Now, it came out later that Barry Alvarez and Gary Anderson acknowledged the fact that this had happened, but that it was a quick conversation and that, he's committed to the University of Wisconsin. But Ben, is he?
It happens all the time. I mean, if we had Barry Alvarez on the show, we asked him how many times he had an NFL opportunity. I mean, it happens. The former head coach, Brett Bielema, had a number of NFL opportunities while he was here. If you're a good coach, people take notice. I mean, look what the rebuilding job Gary Anderson did at Utah State over the course of 4 seasons, leading that team to, an 11-2 season in his final year there, and a bowl win. Then he comes to Wisconsin, has some success here, and it's going to be a thing where if you are a winning head coach, people are going to inquire about your services and availability. But I can't see Gary Anderson as an NFL head coach. But if the NFL calls, you're probably going to listen. I mean, if you would do it too, I'm sure, Phil, if you were a college coach.
Totally, but here's the thing. Wisconsin has a schedule built for them the next 2 years that could lead to some pretty big success, correct? You'd agree with that? Well, what if he has a couple of big years here and then the NFL comes calling again? They're already calling right now. Panic button. No, that would be all good because then you have 2 national championships and you're feeling pretty good about yourself.
Would you rather have a head coach that's in demand or a head coach that no one wants? I mean, you probably would want, you probably want the head coach that everyone wants to talk to and try to take away. But you look at, Gary Anderson, he's a guy who's talked about Wisconsin being kind of a destination job. Now, the former head coach said that as well, but he was here for 7 years and decided to go woo pig suey and go somewhere else. That hasn't turned out very well for him so far. But you look at what Gary Anderson has done. I think he's very excited about the future of this program because, like you mentioned, the next 2 years set up well. Just signed a monster signing class, and he took the call. I don't think there was any in-person formal interview or anything like that. It's secret though. We don't know. But it's certainly a situation where Wisconsin fans certainly got a little agitated about earlier this week. But I think those statements that Gary Anderson and Barry Alvarez kind of sent out kind of calmed the waters a little bit. You can tell that Anderson wants to be here. Just the question is, will Anderson be here for 15, 20 years? Will he be here for 5 or 10? I don't think we really know, but I think people are excited about the direction of this program with Gary Anderson leading it.
And how about the shot across the bow from Alvarez in the release saying, too, really pleased with the way that Gary Anderson handled this, coming to me immediately with the contact from the Browns. Hey, last little thought here, too, because the Wisconsin Badger men's basketball team gets Michigan. Now, what happened last time they saw them? Here's some highlights that we had from them. What are we supposed to take from this Wisconsin-Michigan and the way that the 2 teams are playing? Because Michigan's playing loose and has a lot of good talent that we know, even without some of their bigger names, losing a Trey Burke, without a Mitch McGarry, they're still winning games and a really good team.
Michigan with a great come-from-behind victory at Ohio State on Tuesday night. Michigan's beaten 3 top 25 teams on the road this year. Just an incredible achievement. This was one of them, too, when you beat a number 3 Wisconsin. Wisconsin did not play very well in this game. Let Michigan shoot a obscenely high percentage in this game as well. And I think Wisconsin needs to continue tightening up their post defense. We've seen it take steps forward the last couple of games. It's certainly not where it needs to be. But here against Michigan, this was the first half where Wisconsin did not defend the paint well. Then the second half, they didn't defend the jump shot well. And Nick Stauskas, one of the best players in the Big Ten. Wisconsin will need to pressure him. This is going to be a tough game. It's going to be a tough next week for Wisconsin. At Michigan on Sunday, then you're at Iowa on Saturday. Wisconsin needs to go at least 1-1 in those games because otherwise it's going to be a tough slaying the rest of the way.
Oh, we'll have it for you next week, so don't go anywhere and find us on YouTube here on Inside Badger Nation.